In this video, we will be discussing one of the most controversial game design choices developers can make, to use procedural generation in a game. On my other Starfield videos, one of the most common comments I see is related to procedural generation, and it is quite clear that most people are against it. So we will discuss what procedural generation is, how it is already being used way more than you may think, and what players mean when they talk about it. Finally, we will tie this all together with how Starfield may, or may not, use procedural generation to fill out its in-game universe. First, what is procedural generation? A quick description from Wikipedia sums it up nicely. Quote, "In computing, procedural generation is a method of creating data algorithmically as opposed to manually. In computer graphics, it is also called random generation and is commonly used to create textures and 3D models. In video games, it is used to automatically create large amounts of content in a game. Advantages of procedural generation include smaller file sizes, larger amounts of content, and randomness for less predictable gameplay." End quote. Games you may have played that use what gamers commonly refer to as procedurally generated worlds include Minecraft, Elite Dangerous, and No Man's Sky. These are great examples, in different ways, of the power and limitations of procedural generation. In a game like Minecraft, which really is a sandbox game, it is an asset. You have an entirely new world to explore each time you play, and you can tweak the generation process to include more or less of certain components. This allows the player some creative freedom when they want to start a new playthrough. In Elite Dangerous, also a space flight simulation game, procedural generation is used to create entire solar systems complete with suns, planets, moons, and more, giving the entire Milky Way galaxy a sense of realism and allowing the player to discover these locations. This works well for the game considering that planetary exploration, while possible, isn't a key component of the game. Finally, another familiar and infamous game, at least at launch, is No Man's Sky. When it launched, the procedurally generated worlds it offered all quickly started to look the same. While technically different, they lacked the personal touch that many gamers expected or hoped for. Boasting over a quintillion planets to explore doesn't really matter if they all look pretty similar and you are doing the exact same thing on every one. I think this example is what everyone jumps to when they are worried about developers using procedural generation in their games. It is legitimate, because if you lose the sense of exploration in a game based on exploration, well, the whole experience dramatically suffers. A less extreme example of procedural generation is loot in a chest in Skyrim. In most chests, this is randomly generated based on a variety of factors, such as the player's level in the game. Other games will use procedural generation in this manner as well. Bethesda has already explained that their current world creation process starts with their software randomly generating the entire game overworld map. This allows them to get the broad strokes out of the way, and then they will spend the next several years of development tweaking the map to their exact specifications as it relates to locations, quests, caves, towns and cities, realistic roadways to and from those cities, and more. It is a highly efficient way of creating a large game world while also including all of the unique touches from an actual developer that make a game special. So, while procedurally generated worlds can be controversial, it is their actual implementation that can make or break a game. As it relates to Starfield, there are a few different ways that Bethesda may be using procedural generation. First, and what I think is most likely, will be to create the bespoke planets that we may be exploring, if applicable. I think it is quite a safe assumption that there will be planets to explore in Starfield. Bethesda could use their tried and true method of procedural generation mixed with developers going back and tweaking the game world to fit the rest of the game. This is the most likely method, though unfortunately it is also the most limited. One thing about space is that it is huge. Just having it as a setting almost forces creators to think on a much larger scale, and this is also true in video games. If Bethesda wants Starfield to have a sense of scale appropriate for a game set in space, well, just a few planets to explore could severely restrict that experience. Not that it would be a terrible thing if properly executed, but it really could reduce the sense of exploration of the unknown, which is, in my opinion, one of the best and main reasons to have your game set in space in the first place. Now, on the other end of the spectrum would be entire procedurally generated planets and solar systems, similar to what No Man's Sky and Elite Dangerous do. Doing this would allow for the huge sense of scale and exploration that Bethesda may want the player to have, though it would come at a high cost. You've seen how bland a procedurally generated world can be after you've explored even a handful of them. No matter how advanced the algorithm may be, it is not a substitute for an artist or developer handcrafting all or even part of a world. I doubt that Bethesda would go this route if for no other reason than it would also handicap their ability to have meaningful quests and interactions with whatever NPCs may be in the game. One compromise could be procedurally generating uninhabited planets, while also having inhabited ones follow the same sort of creation process that Bethesda has always used. This would work in a realistic sense, as you aren't necessarily worried about topographical features or terrain on an uninhabited world like you are on one with cities, towns, and more that the player will likely be spending way more time in. Procedurally generated planets with a varied range of environments, gravity, terrain, etc. would be fine if you are hunting some kind of wildlife or simply mining for resources. This would provide an interesting juxtaposition with the crafted and inhabited worlds in which you may spend the bulk of your time questing or exploring. Personally, I think this is the best compromise to retain a sense of scale that a space game should have, while also providing the handcrafted or personal touch to each of the locations you'll spend a significant amount of time in. Even if Bethesda limits the actual planets that you can explore to a handful, there are other ways that they could incorporate procedural generation. One way would be to have randomly generated encounters while the player is in the actual process of space travel. Think about going from point A to point B in space, and as you are traveling along, you receive a notification of a derelict space vessel that you could choose to stop at and explore. The entire vessel could be randomly generated along with all of the loot you may acquire from it. Alternatively, all of these derelict vessels could be handcrafted with entire stories of their own, but their appearance could be the randomly generated element. I'd love to receive a notification telling me that there is a vessel that appears to be deserted and gives me the option to dock and explore. This could allow for the player to unravel a mystery as to where the crew went, if there was some kind of epidemic on the ship, an alien type of encounter, or if it was simply just abandoned. Think exploring a vault from Fallout, but in space. The great thing about space is that it is huge, and even if Bethesda goes for realism in Starfield, there are all kinds of cool psychological factors associated with space travel that they could explore. Bethesda could also employ a mixture of carefully placed, handcrafted experiences and procedurally generated content, which would provide a nice gameplay balance for players. This is considered filler to some people, but then again, you can make the same argument for side quests. Either way, it is another scenario in which procedural generation could be used. At the end of the day, I think most gamers would agree that some procedurally generated content isn't a bad thing. If the entire game is procedurally generated, well, that is where you will find people starting to get upset. There's no indication that Bethesda would consider doing this, but the question keeps coming up because using space as the backdrop of your game, and there's simply no bigger stage, begs the question of how exploration will be handled. Bethesda Game Studios games are known for their exploration, so ultimately, this is a valid question and people are bringing it up for a reason. Hopefully Bethesda will reveal more about Starfield in the coming months. At that time, we can determine how much, if any, procedural generation is being used to help deliver a game we have all been waiting for a very long time. What are your thoughts on procedural generation? Is it okay in small amounts? Is it the devil? Let's discuss in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this video, please be sure to like and subscribe. As always, thank you so much for watching.